Jennifer Dugan, and I'm a teacher in HS Squared. I've been teaching English in Reynoldsburg for 16 years. From my understanding, code switching is when people change pretty much everything that there is about themselves. So the way they speak, the vocabulary that they use, the clothes that they wear, and their mannerisms, depending upon their environment. To a certain degree, I use code switching at school because it can be off-putting if I'm my typical self with students. They don't necessarily feel like they can relate to me, but I also, it's minimal. I don't do it a whole lot because I want to model what I think is kind of a different behavior, and so I will do it, but I don't do it all that often. I think it's necessary because depending upon how different your worlds are, you need to behave differently and speak differently in order to be successful. So for example, if you're going to work, you need to speak the way that you would professionally, and you know, we want that to happen at school as well, so people are practicing. But if it isn't your authentic self, then I wouldn't want you to behave that way with family and friends. There are certain things that you do and don't say, certain ways that you do and don't dress, depending upon the circumstances. I do think it can be problematic though when people feel like they can't be themselves. So I'll give you an example. If you have a student that's incredibly bright and articulate, sometimes students feel as though they can't act that way at school, even though that's who they are. So I think it can be detrimental, but I think it can also help people be successful. So I spent a year in France. So to a certain degree, not like you, I was in school, but it didn't matter. It was a 5th year of high school. But it can be very difficult if you stay with people who speak your language, who wear your clothes, who have the same cultural background as you do. It becomes very difficult to learn the new culture, the new language, the new way of life. However, it can be really beneficial. So let's say you're in class and you have a limited knowledge of the language, but you're with someone who has a deeper knowledge of English. You can use your original language to learn a new language. So I think that it can be isolating at times. People will look strangely, but I think it's typically because they think you're talking about them, right? So it's people's insecurity and people's security that makes them judgmental. So there is a downside, but I also think that it is important that you not let go of your culture and that you hold on to that. There needs to be a balance, because if you don't learn English and you live in the United States, it becomes very difficult to fulfill the dreams that you may have. I think it's necessary for survival. There are certain circumstances where people will be judged and ridiculed for being a certain way, and so sometimes it is necessary for survival. But I do wish that people could be more open to differences. I think that's the problem. You have people at her school who weren't accepting of people who were different, and so she felt like she had to behave like them, and the same was true at home. And it would be wonderful if we could sort of bridge that gap so people could have the qualities of both. I think the biggest challenge is to communicate and to be open. So for example, at her school, with her friends at school, if she could start to share some of what she's feeling and experiencing. I think in her book and in general, I think when we have students that come from different cultures other than the one that we live in, they do feel like they live in two worlds. The rules are different. The behaviors are different. Food is different. I remember when I first started teaching, and we had a number of students who, in their home, it was disrespectful to look an adult in the eye. But when they came to school, that was the expectation. And it was very difficult for them because they were getting in trouble for being respectful, but it was what was respectful at home. And I read it in a book. A student never said to me, I need, at home I'm not allowed to look somebody in the eye. So if people are communicating and explaining, then I think we could start to bridge the gap.
Heading to interview Mr. Sesley to get his insight on code
What
switching.
is code switching to you?
Code switching is being able to adapt to a given situation, depending on, it could be social, it could be professional, it could be social or professionally related. So yeah, just adapting to a given situation.
How do you feel about code switching?
I feel like it's necessary. It's like being book smart and street smart. The more knowledge you have on what to do in certain situations, the more helpful it is for you to be successful in those situations.
What is your experience with code switching?
Being an African American male, I think it's very important to be able to speak proper English or know the correct lingo or how to speak professionally or respectfully or tactfully in given situations, so people could, for me personally, just hold me at the high standard or esteem as my counterparts that may be of another race.
Do you notice code switching in your daily life?
When I was younger, yes. Now, maybe every once in a while when I'm around my peers, but that's not often. I feel like that me being politically correct and proper speaking has become more of my daily life. If people try to appropriate to act like somebody, I guess that would be code switching. Like people thinking it's fun to, I guess they say what, culture vulture? Like trying to act like something that you're not. But then I guess the question would be, what is that, right? It's all about how you were raised. So I really think it depends. I always hear a lot like, oh, you sound white or you sound black, but it has nothing to do sometimes with code switching, but more so on where you were raised at and how you were brought up. But yeah, sometimes culture vultures are people that act like it. I guess you can kind of sense it a little bit.
People often hang around with other people whom they have similar backgrounds to. For example, the same language they speak, same sports they play, or anything they have in common.
I'm from New Brunswick, Canada. I was born and raised there, and then when I was graduating from high school, I came to the U.S. for college. I think, from what I understand, is that when you know a different language, that you go back and forth between the language or the vocabulary or the pronunciation even that you're used to, and you kind of mix them together. So you speak a little bit of both. I think I do, but I think I also don't know what people are saying sometimes. So I think sometimes students use dialect vocabulary that they mean something different. You know, when people say, oh, that's bad, but they really mean good. I think there are things like that that maybe I'm not even aware of. No, not really. I mean, as far as language goes and growing up, there are words that I use growing up that people here don't use. Or, for instance, we would say produce instead of produce at the grocery store. Or when you say I'm going to the house or house, I can't even do it anymore because it's been so long. But people used to make fun of the way I said words or different words, garage, garage.
Yep.
Okay. But now, because I've been here so long, I've adapted and changed because I didn't want to stand out as saying words wrong.
See, that's right.
It didn't bother me. I just felt like it's something you do to adjust to your environment so that you fit in. But I guess some people would feel that you're changing, but I just didn't want attention from saying words differently. So, but it doesn't bother me if somebody does that. There's a certain part of it you want to be true to yourself, but also you want to just you want to fit in where you are, too. but I don't think I'm around people in such a way that it would be a big issue. No, I had foreign exchange students live with me for a couple years ago for a few months, and they would say the wrong words, and I can't even remember examples, but you know, they'd say life instead of live, or you know, they get things, and or they would sometimes mix in German, or what was really funny is they'd be talking to their family back in Germany, and they'd start speaking English and not even realize they'd done it, and their families would start laughing. Or vice versa, they would start talking to me in German or Spanish. There were two different girls.
So from
But it didn't bother me. I just accepted, you know.
yeah.
Now, I suppose it might bother me if I was in a situation where I walked in a restaurant and there were people of a different race or culture, and they started talking in their language, and I felt like they were talking about me.
Yeah, no, I know. how
Then
you
that
feel.
might
Yeah.
bother me. Yes, if it's not intentional to be rude or, you know, that kind of thing. If it's not intentional to be rude, it's a hard situation. I understand that. I also think you should be true to yourself. So you have to find a balance. I'm not going to say it's right or wrong, because no matter where we are, we try to adapt to the environment around us to feel comfortable and safe and not made fun of, etc. So I'd want her to be true to herself, but at the same time, I understand to some degree how you do that. Probably would, just because I'd be nervous about being in a different environment. To be honest, I probably would have done this. Is that what she did?
Yeah, she
probably
did code
would
switch
have.
between.
I'm not saying that that's necessarily the best thing, but I understand, and I would probably do the same thing.
A recent study shows that only 40% of white Americans have friends outside of their own race.
It's where students, people change their dialect to align with the group that they're with. I think it's wonderful. I mean, people should be comfortable when they're communicating, and it allows the group that they're with to feel comfortable and understand their communication, as long as it doesn't break down the understanding and comprehension. I think it's fine. No, I don't think it's being fake. I think it's you feel comfortable in a certain environment, and that's part of your comfort zone. So I don't think there's anything wrong with it, as long as whomever it is, they know standard English, you know, how to write, how to speak, and how to understand others. Maybe if someone enters the group and doesn't understand it, then they're not able to be part of the communication that's going on. So they would have to learn it. It's sort of like being in a situation where everybody's speaking a foreign language and you don't understand it, and then you can't communicate with them. So there's a breakdown in communications as a result of that. But as long as it doesn't affect their ability to use standard English or whatever their standard is for their first language, then I don't see a problem with it. I don't know, other than there are times when you have to switch to a formal tone. That is definitely something that is needed periodically. So if that's part of the code switch, I mean, I would say yes, that there are times when you're switching from an informal to a formal setting, then you would have to switch it up. As long as the person who's doing it or the group that's doing it knows standard.
Code switching is when if you're around a certain group of people, you're going to talk in a different way. So for me as a teacher, I'm going to talk to students differently than I would talk to my coworkers, and I would talk to my coworkers differently than I talk to my principal. Just using different language, maybe slang that I wouldn't necessarily use around somebody else. It's a normal part of everyday life. I mean, you have to be respectful of certain people. So like as a student, you should be respectful to a teacher. You shouldn't talk and use language that you shouldn't use around a teacher. While it's more understandable if you're talking to your friends at home or something like that, and there aren't adults, it makes sense that you might talk to them. Yeah, probably. I think certain students, you see them in an enriched class, you'll see them kind of talk differently to their fellow classmates than you would maybe in the hallway when they're with their actual friends. Yeah, I've seen it that way probably. I mean, I think it allows people to connect better with their group of friends that they're with. You know, if you're acting fake around a group of friends and you're acting a different way, they might notice that and have a problem with it. And so you kind of code switch to match what they are and kind of get along with them a little bit better. I wouldn't necessarily say they're being fake to themselves. I think you just naturally talk differently. Like I said, with slang, with some of your language that you might use, you can naturally talk differently around different people.
So how?
On me specifically?
Yeah.
Usually, I mean, most students are pretty respectful of teachers, so they're going to talk differently. I'm not going to hear them, cussing as much as I normally do in the hallways when I happen to stick my head out. So usually when they talk to me, there's no cussing and there's less slang, but not always. Just the natural way we talk to different people. I can tell you, like in my experience, if I was hanging out with friends who were in my enriched classes or my AP classes, I would talk probably a little bit more in full sentences and more respectful. Whereas if I was with some of my other friends, I might talk a little bit more with slang, a little bit more disrespectful, say some things probably shouldn't say, things like that.
I believe code switching is when we act and talk in one way in one environment and do that differently in a separate environment. Yes, I would say I have a different demeanor when I'm at work, more professional, than I do with family and friends. Absolutely. I do notice that with students in particular, especially if they don't know an administrator is around, you'll hear a conversation going one way, but then when you come around the corner, the language might change or you might hear a different conversation. I think it's good because it shows an awareness of the students, that there is a sense of respect for the adults in the building, and there's a sense that they know they need to change how they're talking and the language that they're using. Yes, it's very noticeable. Like I said, tend to hear a lot of profanity when I am not visible, but once I'm in sight, there's apologies and, oh, I didn't mean it, Ms. Cox. So there's an awareness, and I feel good that students are aware of that. I think when people are trying to not be their authentic self in front of people, that could be a negative side to that. And if the environment is right, I don't think people should try to be someone that they're not or try not to embrace who they are, especially if it's an informal setting. I think when a person feels like they are not being true to who they are at their core, that is a sign that they need to be mindful and not give up who they are totally to please, for instance, another person or a group of people.
Right.
I think in Star's situation, she was code switching to fit into that school environment where she was every day. I think she was not wanting to be ostracized on some level. And I don't know that she went too far. I mean, some of the people who really knew her knew that she was from a different background than she was. So I think in that sense, it was more of her trying to fit in, but she still came home to a culture where she embraced who she was. I didn't feel like she was trying to hide that totally. Well, I think it's good conversation to talk about this code switching. Getting students to embrace who they are, getting them to feel comfortable in the environment that they're in. I think code switching or learning more about it is good so that students can learn to navigate in different situations. So we might have different scenarios set up where, this is how you would act in this situation if you were with friends. This is how you would act in this situation if you were with your parents. This is how you would act in this situation if you were on a job interview. So I think getting to learn your audience and knowing what's appropriate for different audiences, I think that's important for all of us to know. I think people feel like they have to meet a certain standard in a given environment. So if I'm on a job interview, I'm not going to use slang that I might use around friends and family. So I think it's just about learning the environment that you're in and being able to adapt. I think it's a matter of trying to fit in, getting a sense of belonging, trying to see what that group wants or what it takes to fit in with a particular group. So I think that's why some students will code switch amongst their peers.